Right. Welcome, everybody, to conversation number 86. We're talking observed power, temptations, and misunderstandings. But before we start, I would like to thank our sponsors. As always, we have to start by thanking Conductrix. They've been with us from the very beginning. Thank you, Matt, Nate, Ezekiel, Ashley, and the entire team at Conductrix so much for supporting the TLC. And we would also like to thank our other TLC newsletter sponsors, including Conductrix and EPO, Growthbook, and AB Smartly. Thank you all so much for providing your thought leadership to the community. It means so much. We enjoy reading your content every month. In fact, if you haven't checked out the Halloween edition of the newsletter, which came out yesterday, there's a link to it in the TLC Slack. You all should go check it out. It's actually quite a lot of fun. And last, far from least, thank you, Convert and Blazing Growth, for sponsoring the TLC community. It makes all of our swag and all of that stuff, and of course, the Slack itself possible. So thank you so much. And before we introduce Georgi, I want to talk about some announcements and reminders. First, hey, the super early bird registration ended today, but early bird ends December 1st. So y'all need to register for Experimentation Island. We've got lots of really, really great presenters, lots of great events. It's 1/3, 10 great speakers, 1/3 unconference sessions, breakout sessions, and 1/3 community. So great stuff. Please, please, please register. It's going to be a lot of fun. Next, we have Aaron Weigel, Lucas Bernardi doing the Good Experimental Design Workshop based on Aaron's book. Y'all should, if you haven't read it, absolutely check it out. And then register for Aaron's TLC learning group, cohort-based learning. Highly, highly recommend it. And as you all know, Jill Quick is also teaching Google Analytics 4 fundamentals, bit.ly GA4Jill, which is, fun. That's in February, so check that out. So what can we say about today's speaker? Everybody knows you, but one of the things that's, a fun saying that I've always felt was true, and unfortunately has been proven true a few times: you should never meet your heroes. But the industry that we live in keeps proving me wrong again and again, from Tone to Els to Gershoff to you, sir. Y'all are the reason we need more teachers in the world. Thank you for teaching. From statistical methods, which you noticed was on my shelf, but for everybody else, look at all of these sticky notes. This is not just a book, it's like my Bible. And if y'all haven't read it, you need to get it and read it and use it, because it's one of the best books in our industry for learning about how to do what we do. And this man wrote it, provided it, and helped me become the experimenter that I am today. And from that to the analytics toolkit itself and all the blogs in there, we need more content like that, and we need more teachers like you, from asking the good questions and answering them like you do every day. I really, really appreciate it, and I've appreciated learning from you. So from that, I'm going to pass the screen share over to you and let you continue to teach us. So thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I mean, I don't know what to say after this intro. It's a pleasure to be here among you and to present on a topic that has been interesting for me and hopefully for you at this time. Observed power, temptations and misunderstandings, as Kelly said. I guess I don't need that slide at all. Skipping right to the agenda. The reason we're going to talk about observed power today is that it's a highly used but also misunderstood statistic. But to really dig into why that's the case, we're going to start with a refresher on what statistical power is, and then we're going to continue to the real meat of the topic, which is, do we really need high true power? And then a whole lot about observed power, how it works as an estimate of true power, some dangers of using observed power, some practical questions around certain A/B testing calculators practices surrounding observed power. And then we're going to dive into the sneaky ways to employ observed power, which I mean, some people use without ever understanding it has anything to do with it. So I think it's going to be an interesting topic. It has shown to be interesting in online discussions so far. So without further ado, what is statistical power? That is in itself, without even going on the observed side, one of the most misunderstood concepts in statistics. And the simple reason for that is that it relies on understanding so many linked concepts. First of all, hypothesis testing. Then you need to really understand statistical significance testing, p-values, how to interpret them properly. And if you understand all that, then you can jump into power. Like before that, you really are playing with fire if you try to approach this topic. And unfortunately, that's true not just for practitioners, but also for some educators. For example, there are textbooks, online presentations you can find where statistical power is often defined as the probability of finding an effect if there is one. And that is actually untrue. And just a simple look at this graph will tell you that. But just to contrast that simple, really innocent sounding definition with the proper definition, which is that the power of a statistical test is the probability of observing a p-value statistically significant at a certain threshold, let's call it alpha, if a true effect of a certain magnitude is in fact present. Don't bother with the annotation here, it's just really not that important right now. But you can really contrast how the two look and feel once you read them and understand that, yeah, you can't really cut corners this way and convey the accurate meaning of statistical power. And to get to what it actually is, this graph here should help us a lot. That's the power curve of a sample, of an example test. It's a properly powered one, has a good enough sample size in the 100,000 users. And on the x-axis, you see hypothetical true effect sizes expressed as a percentage difference. So 0 would be no true effect, and then you get to the right some small positive effects, and to the left some negative true effects. And then on the y-axis, you have the power going from 0 to 100. It can also be expressed from 0 to 1 in certain materials. It doesn't really change anything. And so what you can see is that for each power level, there is a true effect size corresponding to it. And you can use statistical power in three main ways, basically. So one is to determine the sample size of a test, given that you have a target power level and a determined minimum effect of interest. So if you have these two quantities, you can use power calculations to determine what kind of sample size you need in order for this function to have a shape where, let's say, if your target power level is 80%, and your minimum effective interest is, in this case, 4.9, then you would need about 200,000 users to have this shape of the power curve. And basically, this means that this point is exactly where you want it. So that's one way to use it. The other two ways are to estimate the power level for a given effective interest. So you start with a given sample size in mind or a given test duration, which translates to some sample size. And then you say, okay, with that many users or sessions or whatever, what is the effect, what is the power level for this effect size? In this case, let's say it's 6%, and so that would be just over 90% if we just do the same horizontal and vertical lines here to check where the function lies. And the final way to use statistical power is to estimate the minimum effect you could detect for a given power level. Typically, these would be high power levels like 80, 90, 95%, because you want to know, okay, what is an effect that I can detect with high probability? And so this way, in this way, you just start from by looking at the y-axis, and then you say, okay, if I draw a horizontal line here, where does it cross the power curve? And then you drop the vertical line, and you get DMD. These are actually really, really basic things. Like, to properly explain power, obviously it will take me much more, but I hope that's a useful refresher before we continue with what observed power is and how that can be used or misused. Now, observed power, everything that we said so far holds, but instead of using it in these different ways that I just described, we use it after a test has ended or after we have some data. And taking this example test here, let's say we have just one variant versus the control to simplify things as much as possible. We have an observed effect of just over 2%, a relative lift. And you can see the confidence is pretty high, almost 98%. The p-value is really small, respectively, at 0.02. So at this point, some people start to ask the question, okay, what is the power for the lift we just observed? And then they look at a paragraph, maybe something like this, and they say, okay, looking at starting from the x-axis, this is just above 2%. So we have, in this case, 27% observed power. That's the power versus the observed effect size. And here's where trouble begins usually. What happened here? Like, we targeted high power levels, 80, 90, 95%, but we got just 27. Is it cause for concern? Is our test truly underpowered? Is it like, does it have low true power, basically low power to detect the true effect size? Or in general, are the results trustworthy at all? Should we trust what we see with our eyes? Is this result really significant? Should we accept the result based on the fact that we have a low p-value or high confidence? And to answer that, I'll take a little step back and go to the reasoning which underlies a lot of these questions. And these stem from the fact that a lot of us who know about power, we've heard this phrase that, yeah, you want to have high power in your test, and typically it's expressed in terms of high power to detect the true effect size, whatever it may be. So basically that's premise one. Good statistical tests should have high true power. Then there are some other logical steps. Basically, the true effect size is by definition unknown. If we knew it, we wouldn't be testing. So that's unknown, and there is often little data to suggest what it might be. Sometimes there are previous tests, sometimes we're working based off tests by others, but really we can't translate that easily to what we're doing. And so good pre-test predictions are really difficult to come by. And then post data, after we have some data, the point estimate, so in simpler tests that would be the observed lift, is our best guess for the effect size. And from that, we can go into thinking, okay, what if we substitute the true effect size for the observed effect in the power calculation? Wouldn't that result in a good estimate of the true power of a test? And like, at first glance, it sounds like it would. And so the conclusion from these four premises, from this logical chain, is that a good test should achieve high observed power, high power to detect the observed effect size. And unfortunately, those two are actually not true, which obviously renders the conclusion not true as well. But don't just take my word for that. We'll go through this in some detail. So first of all, why is there the notion that true power matters? The idea here is that if there is some positive, obviously, true effect, you want to be able to detect it, but because you want to capture that increase in revenue, conversions, signups, subscriptions, whatever. And that sounds right initially, but if you actually implement some kind of a decision-making framework to the problem, in this case, I'm applying my own framework, but it's really not that novel or that radical or anything like that. It's pretty common sense. Without going into details, even if you assume that the true effect size, which you consider most probable, is, let's say, about 1% or just below it, you should still leave some room for uncertainty. In this case, it's not too big. It's from roughly -8 to +10%. Obviously, there would be tests where that would be smaller or larger. But whatever the uncertainty range is, you want to make sure that you're not running your test for too long, because if the true effect size is negative, then you would be exposing the users in the variant group to a negative experience, money losing experience, basically, for longer than necessary. And if the true effect is actually positive, you would be missing out on that revenue during the tests. And also, we don't want the test to be too short, because then the power curve, which is in this case the blue line here, would actually, the S would be much more stretched out, and so you would have really low power right here. And given that in this case we expect the true effect to be in this range, that's really a bad thing, because then you would have a high false negative rate. You would be missing a lot of true improvements, simply due to the fact that your sample size is too small. And in a lot of these calculations, in a lot of risk-reward analysis, which aim to come to optimal balance between risk and reward, and to arrive at a sample size and significance threshold, which result in optimal tests in this sense, you would find that the minimum effective interest at some high power level, let's say 80% or higher, is typically larger than the true effect size that you input as most probable. Like, this is determined by you. You say, okay, this is the effect that I consider most probable. It could be 0, it could be positive, it could be negative, doesn't matter. In many occasions, you would have the MD at a power level of 80% or higher be higher than the true effect size. So basically, what this means is that good tests, good in terms of efficient, optimal, bringing positive business value, actually, maybe it would be a stretch to say typically, but at least very often come with parameters like this, where the minimum effective interest is much higher than the true effect that is considered most probable. In this case, it's about 2 times higher, which is a lot. And yeah, that's something where, if you look into the maths a lot, you will see how it makes sense. I hope I sketched it in broad strokes that make it understandable. But even if you didn't capture why that's important, I'll proceed from the next slide as if this slide never happened. So even if you fail to capture it, I mean, to fully explain it, it will take probably a couple of hours. So I'm not gonna spend more time on that. Assuming none of that happened, assuming true power is still considered important. Let's see how observed power enters the picture. So if you remember the argument, the idea was, okay, we have a good test requires high true power, and then we use the observed power as a proxy as an estimate for true power. But an estimate is a really technical thing. It's not just something that can be conjured from thin air. And there are well-established, accepted principles, characteristics of good statistical estimates. And these come in 4 categories: consistency, unbiasedness, sufficiency, and efficiency. Briefly, consistency is the tendency for the estimate to hone in on the true value, whatever it may be. Unbiasedness is that while honing in, the estimate isn't going to be positively or negatively biased. It's going to, in all cases, whatever the circumstance, on average, it's going to be equal to the true value. And then sufficiency and efficiency relate to how well an estimate uses the information in the data and the variance of that estimate. And if you look to the right, you'll see that I've marked down observed power on all of these 4 characteristics. And let's see why. So this is from a 2005 paper, and actually very extensive study by Yuan and Maxwell. And this is from their conclusion, the quote here. And they basically say statistical power is garbage as an estimate of true power. And not wanting to leave you with that quote alone, I did simulations of my own. These are fairly high sample size tests, around, I think, 50,000 users per variant. so 100,000 total, and each simulation was run 100,000 times, and each column is the result of one simulation. So basically, this histogram and this histogram are from the same simulation, but one shows how observed power behaved, and the other shows how the observed effect behaved. In this case, observed power is compared to the true power, and you can see in this example, the true power is 10%, but the average of the observed power was almost 25%, so 2.5 times higher. Definitely signs of bias here, significant bias. And then we have the standard deviation, which is another way to standardized way to show the variance, is really high at 19.6%, given that the whole range of possibilities is from 0 to 100. So that's a huge variance, and this is obviously seen visible on the graph. And then compare that to the distribution of observed effects. In this case, the observed effect is our estimate for the true effect. You can see that the mean observed effect is exactly equal to the true observed effect set in the simulations, and the standard deviation is really small, under 3%. And if I were to scale this x-axis to this x-axis, so from, in this case, minus 10% to plus 90%, it's gonna look like a small, a small column here, like really, really tiny. And this shows you how efficient this estimator is of the actual effect. And briefly going over the other simulations, here we have true power 50%. The average is right about there, so not too bad, but the standard deviation just explodes to almost 30%, which is ridiculous. So the variance is huge. Basically, the value is all over the place. And you can see how the observed effect behaves. These could have very well been the same graphs. They're not, but they very well look like they are. And here again, if the true power is high, in this case 80%, the mean observed power is negatively biased, and again the standard deviation is very big. Nothing like that is happening with the observed effect. It's still a consistent, efficient, sufficient, and unbiased estimate of the true effect size. So if you want to look at true power, observed power is a really bad way to do that. Now, saying that, it can help if we look at observed power from a slightly different angle. In this angle, we are considering how it can be calculated. Like, obviously, one way is to just use the power formula, plug in the observed effect size, calculate the power. But it turns out that observed power is nothing more than a transformation of how the p-value that we observe after a test relates to the significance threshold that we set for it. So this is the formula. It's from a paper from 2001, and that's really the cumulative distribution function of the normal distribution, and these are just your typical z-scores for the significance threshold and the p-value. And then you can see, and I've actually built a calculator that you can play with after the presentation, where we can plug in any significance threshold and any p-value, and it will immediately output the observed power and plot the whole observed power curve, if you will. So you'll know that for such a test with for any value that you can imagine, any p-value, you can check what the observed power would be. So what this really shows is that there is no additional information in observed value than is already present in the p-value. And how there is also another way that we can use that information, and that is by looking at the graph of how observed power relates to the p-value. Now, we can see that for non-significant tests, so basically everything to the right of the green line, which is at 0.05, taking a textbook example here, just to avoid any confusion. And you can see these outcomes are non-statistically significant, and all of them are below, like the curve drops below 50 and never recovers. So all of them would appear to have low observed power. And as you can see, if we replace, if we use observed power as a proxy for true power, this would basically render all of these tests to seem underpowered. And there is another thing happening here, which is the lower the observed power, the more it suggests the tests have missed a real true effect. Because like if we use it as a proxy for true power, it's saying, okay, your test probably didn't fail because there was no effect, but it probably failed because you didn't have a large enough sample size. However, so yeah, lower observed power indicates better evidence that there is an effect. But then in the same direction, higher p-values, which is lower certainty, lower confidence, sorry, actually indicates worse evidence. So these can't both be true at the same time, because yeah, they are obviously, but this is just one other way to see that observed power really can only lead to incorrect conclusions, because obviously the p-value here is its interpretation would be the correct one. And then if we switch to what happens with statistically significance tests, where we look at observed power, there are then two scenarios. For most of them, you will determine that they are underpowered, that the observed power is lower than your target power level. Let's say if it's 80%, you would be looking at all of these values from 0.001, I think, all the way to 0.05. These are gonna look like they're underpowered if you use observed power. And on the other hand, if you start requiring observed power to meet the target power threshold, so let's say in this case you want both statistical significance and observed power to be greater than 80%. So statistical significance means lower than 0.05 here. That actually shifts your threshold for evidence way higher. Like it's tens of times stricter threshold, because you're moving all the way up this curve, all the way into these values, and this means you would only be accepting like super highly significant p-values. And obviously there is nothing wrong about that. There is nothing wrong about requiring stricter tests, but that's not the right way to do it. The right way is to adjust your significance threshold. And after all of this, I want to bring us back to a more practical level. And this is what happens when some statistical calculators try to use observed power to guide their users. So in this, the logic, I think, is something like this. We know some users perform tests without a set sample size or duration, so that naturally results in peaking, whereas others test with inadequate statistical power. So maybe they choose an MD which is way too optimistic. So 10, 15, 20%, 50% I've seen. Obviously, these are valid MDs, and in some tests they might make sense. Most of the time they wouldn't, or they would be restricting their test to too low a time threshold. So maybe you expect your test to end in 1 week or several days even, or maybe 2 weeks, but maybe in 2 weeks you only have like, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 users and your variance is high. So that leaves out a lot of realistic effect sizes out. And if you've seen my meta-analysis, then you'll know that realistic effect sizes are typically single digit percentages. So, and yeah, knowing all that, here is one idea. First of all, addressing the first issue, let's use observed power to detect peaking. And guess who fell for it? Yeah, I'm a little bit ashamed to say, but it's true. And in the early days of analyticstoolkits.com, the statistical significance calculator would output something like this if you had a statistically significant outcome. So the idea there was I wanted to prevent users from peaking. I wanted to see, okay, well, is this test probably from peaking? And I wanted to alert them to that. And I wanted to alert them to the fact that, yeah, you shouldn't really be doing that. You should probably use a sample size calculator or use a preset duration or something like that. And yeah, that's not great, but that's not the worst that could happen. So another idea is let's use observed power to nudge the users to conduct properly powered tests. And here is where it gets wild. So what it results in is that you will see alerts for users who are doing significance calculations or confidence interval calculations or Bayesian posterior calculations or whatever. And there would be a notice that, okay, well, this test is underpowered, or this test is overpowered, or this test didn't reach the required sample size, or maybe there would be an alert saying, this test requires a sample size of X. So maybe the test was designed with a sample size of 10,000, and you reach the 10,000 roughly, and you enter the numbers, and the calculator will tell you, oh, based on observed power, you need to run this test for another 40,000 users. Or let's say if this was 2 weeks, you would need to run it for how many more weeks is that? I think it's 10 weeks in total, so eight more weeks. And so yeah, that's what can happen if calculators try to fix users but don't really know what they're doing, or are optimistic of the data that the users provide, because obviously users provide only a limited set of information, and peaking and how they chose their power level and whatnot, not really part of that typically. Actually, that was one of the reasons this is a little segue here, one of the reasons I redesigned my software analytics toolkit, so it now stores the information from the planning phase, and then you enter your statistical significance calculations and the information required for that. And yeah, you can still do it the old-fashioned way, but it's really discouraged. They're discouraged. So yeah, what this leads to in practice, if a tool implements that and they start nudging users to extend their test duration based on observed power, well, you can already guess based on the graphs that we showed, where most tests would actually be labeled as underpowered, even statistically significant ones. And yeah, especially if you start extending non-significant tests, because you're thinking, okay, if observed power is low, then the true power is probably low. So maybe if I extend the test a little more, or a lot more in most cases, actually, the recommendations typically are for multiple times longer tests, then I'll be able to detect this elusive effect. And typically that comes with an effect which is positive. So that's what makes it so alluring. You have a small positive effect, and you have this suggestion from the tool that you need to run the test for longer. And wouldn't you know it, you do it. And what happens? So one of the major consequences is 2 times to 3 times. It will depend on some variables, but the inflation of the type 1 error rate, so that's the false positive rate, from your target rate. So if you targeted, let's say 5% confidence level, 95% confidence level, the outcome would actually have a confidence of more like 85% or so. And it also results in multiple times longer test durations. So that's something else to consider. And in the end, this is the histogram of the p-values that you would observe. Normally, for a test where the statistical model matches what's happening with the test, you should have a uniform distribution. So basically, almost a flat line, obviously with slight ups and downs. In this case, you have a huge spike here where there are the statistically significant tests. So this is all below 0.05. And then you have bigger, smaller columns here below, above 0.05, and just a tiny fraction of tests which end here. And that's only because I imposed an upper limit of how much you can extend the tests in terms of sample size. Otherwise, these would all go here mostly. So yeah, basically, but it would take longer. And yeah, that's what happens if you start following these suggestions. Now, I promised you to talk about the sneaky ways to use observed power. And so I'll have to take a step back here, talk a little bit about the MDE. The elusive MDE, or this is abbreviated from minimum detectable effect. Although I have proposed other terms for it that I think lead to a smaller likelihood for misinterpretation. But yeah, nothing is nothing is granted to save you from those. But yeah, I mean, we're back to the power function. And so for any test, if we know the sample size and the significance threshold that we've committed to, we can calculate the minimum detectable effect at various power levels. So at 80%, this would be 4.9 here. At 90%, it's going to be slightly below 6% true effect size, and so on and so forth. Now, so far, so good. We're in the planning stage. But now if we shift to the post-test stage, looking at the same example that we worked with before, 2.02% lift, high confidence, low p-value, and now the observed effect is here, but the MDA is here. And when the MD is here, some people say something must be wrong with the test. We had a minimum detectable effect at 4.9, but we observed a 2% lift, and it's significant. What's happening? And as you can see, there are parallels here with observed power already, but I want to say a few things first before we circle back. There are really easy ways to demonstrate why the MD is not the smallest observed effect that can be statistically significant. This is what most people fall into when they see this, and they think that can't be. They think, okay, how can there be a statistically significant outcome lower than the MD? Well, this is how. In this case, we've taken the true effect to equal the MD, so we are like omniscient, and we know that the true effect is 10%, and we set our MD there. So we have 80% power to detect it. Well, guess what? When the true effect is 10%, 50% of values would be smaller than 10% observed values, and 50% would be larger. And obviously, in this case, all of those that are larger would result in statistically significant tests. But a big proportion of those which are smaller than the MD would also result in a statistically significant outcome. When you look at the color codes here, the dark orange are also tests which are statistically significant, and that's quite a good proportion of them. And then we can change the parameters whichever way we want. For example, here the MD is higher than the true effects. Still, you can see a lot of tests are statistically significant, even if they are lower than the MD. So that's not an issue. That's not a reason to be looking at the MD post-test. Actually, this is also telling us something else. The MD is also not the smallest true effect that can be detected. So notice here that the true effect is at 10%, but it results in a whole bunch of tests which are statistically significant nevertheless. And I mean, if you think about it, if one believes that the MD is the smallest true effect that can be detected, they are envisioning a power curve, something like that. So maybe it's 0 here, and then all of a sudden it jumps right up. And okay, I admit this is a little trick here on my behalf. This is a little misleading because it reaches 100%, and nobody powers their test for 100%. So that's a no, but that is also a no. Like, even if your test is powered at 80%, it doesn't mean the power curve looks like that. So we're back to our good old power function, where we have true effects of all like in a whole in a big range that can result in statistically significant outcomes. And here we know the MD is around 4.9, but you see, obviously, with lower probability, a 2% test can still result in a statistically significant outcome. And after the fact, it doesn't matter that it had low probability before that. It's like the lottery. Like, if you have 1 in a 300 million chance to win the lottery in the USA, well, you win it, and then nobody comes to you and says, you couldn't have won it, like your chances were 1 in 300 million. So yeah, it's pretty much the same logic here. Like, after the fact, the probabilities before the fact don't really matter. And also, if you think about it, obviously, since we have false positives, then that means that statistically significant outcomes can come from truly negative effects, and obviously from 0 as well. So next time you might be thinking, oh, what's that MD? Did it mean that we can't have a statistically significant outcome if the true effect is smaller than that. Nope, you can have a statistically significant outcome even if the true effect is negative. And so these are really two sides of the same coin, and I've deliberately juxtaposed the graphs here. On the left, you have what happens when you're using observed power after the test, and you're saying, oh, it has very low observed power, so probably there's something wrong with the test. Exactly the same thing is happening if you're using the observed effect and comparing it to the MD at that same power level. The outcome is identical. And likewise, if you are doing the opposite, you're requiring both statistical significance and high observed power, you achieve a much stricter threshold. And exactly the same thing happens if you require both a statistically significant outcome and the observed effect to be greater than the MDE. I promise you the graphs are completely identical, and the outcomes also. And just to wrap everything up before the questions, high true power, not really necessary for a test. It can be well powered without a high true power. The true power could be 10%, 20, 30%, and the test could still make business sense. It could be optimal in risk reward management, like from the point of balancing the possible risks with the possible rewards. Then observed power, as we talked, is a really poor estimate of true power. Even if true power is somehow interesting to you after the test, observed power is not the way to estimate the true power. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if there is a good way, because by definition, true power means the power for the true effect size, which is unknown. So yeah, good luck with that. And if you if you come up with a way to estimate the true power after the test, let me know. And then it would help you if you remember that neither the target power level nor the target minimum detectable effect at whatever power level was chosen are thresholds to be met by anything that you observe after the fact. Not by observed power, not by the observed effect, not by anything else. Something else which might help you get your head around the concept is to remember that non-significant outcomes always appear underpowered if you compute observed power. So don't be fooled by that. Don't be tempted to extend tests or to rerun tests simply because there is a low observed power. And finally, the last topic that we touched was requiring high observed power, or requiring that the observed effect is greater than the MD, is the same as greatly increasing the evidential threshold for your test. And yeah, on the flip side, if you start using observed power, that means you really want to mislabel well-powered tests as either underpowered or overpowered. You want to identify trustworthy results as untrustworthy, or maybe you want to peak true observed power, significantly inflating your false positive rate, or on the other side, greatly raise the bar for significance in a really non-obvious and non-intuitive manner. And finally, extending the duration of your tests, extending the sample size if that's what you're after. I guess observed power can help you do that. I hope I didn't lose a lot of the audience, but if you're just waking up, these are the really brief takeaways that you should take from this talk. Please do not be tempted to use observed power. I was tempted, you saw it. It was a mistake that I hope that I won't repeat, obviously. Don't learn from my mistake, don't do it. Also, do not be tempted to compare the MD, which is a strictly pre-test value, to the observed effect size or anything else, confidence intervals, whatever. And finally, please disregard any A/B testing calculator which tells you what sample size to run your test for based on observed power or anything like that. I think these three could save you a lot of trouble. And I know these questions come sometimes from clients who are skeptical because they come with, okay, we targeted 80% power, but if I compute the power against this, or we targeted this MD, but the observed effect is smaller. Typically, it's the latter, I think, the MD angle. That's why I was so insisted on covering it, despite the short time. come back to them with, I think 1 or 2 graphs should be sufficient to educate them. It doesn't need to be a lecture like the one I just gave. And yeah, the talk was based on some of my articles from the past several years, as well as the chapter on power from my book, and some other resources that you might want to consider. But the blog at analyticstoolkit.com typically publishes statistics-related content at really irregular doses. So if there is a way for you to follow that, like with an RSS subscription or something like that, that would be probably useful. And the glossary, I think, is one of a kind in a way. If there are statistical terms that you struggle with, I think a quick glance at the term in that glossary, which should be helpful. And finally, if we can't go through all the questions here, Kelly also already said to post them on the TLC Slack, but if something remains unanswered or there's a question which pops up later, feel free to reach out via DM via LinkedIn or in the TLC space, of course. And with that, I'll turn it to Kelly for the questions and answer question answers section.
Oh, hopefully I don't have to answer.
Well,
I don't know how that's going to go. Your first question is from Tim Wilson. Tim, do you want to ask it or do you want me to read it for you? It's up to you.
Read away.
Read away. All right. Tim says, is it a dangerous oversimplification to say that small but unknowable differences between the observed effect and the true effect have a highly magnified impact on the observed power relative to the true power? I like the dangerous in there. That's, mhm.
Tim, I'm really gonna have to write that down for a response after the call. I'm afraid I'm not gonna produce my best response here on the spot. So, Kelly, if you can send that to me, or if it's in the Slack,
TLC calls channel.
yeah.
But
I'll be sure to answer it publicly there.
Tim, edit your question to tag him so he'll see it. And then
but thank you for the question, Tim. I mean, I think it's a good one. I just am not sure I'm gonna be able to respond on the spot.
Yeah, that's fine. And then Ezekiel says, I feel like doing post-power calculations or post-MDE somehow undermines or overlooks the fact that NHST of this kind is a procedure for mitigating risks as type 1 and type 2 error, as in the value is in the procedure being present and followed versus trying to pick it up apart to search for more stuff. Not to undermine the value. My goodness. Stop adding. He's still adding text.
It's all right. I can wait.
Oh my gosh. He's still typing. Not to undermine the value of understanding each of the singular components of NHST, which thanks a lot for sharing, by the way. I'm talking about the ideal perspective of the common user. I'll keep adding text to the question to make it longer just so you can keep talking. Love ya. Yeah, love you too, Zeke.
Okay, I think I got the point. Yes, I think the on one hand, the let's say the temptation for using observed power stems from the fact that everyone is talking to you about how you should have a large sample size, how you should have a high power to detect a small true effect size. And when you see a small observed effect, it's very easy to jump that bridge and say, well, that's the observed effect. It's a proxy for the true effect. And so let's see the power for that. Did we have a good power in this test? And I already showed why that's a bad idea. I think that's really well illustrates the point Ezekiel has made. And the other is, I think with the MDE, it comes to, I think just misunderstandings there. I think the term is so complicated because, like, if power is complicated, getting the MDE right is, I'm afraid, even more of a challenge, simply because of how the term is phrased. I think the minimum part trips a lot of people up, and I hope these power graphs here can help. Let me can't find them. Sorry. I was sure I'm gonna get to them real quick. Okay, yeah. I hope these power graphs can help, because I think this is what happens in some people's minds. They're like, okay, we have this wall of non-significance below the MD, and yeah, you really there really isn't such a power graph in existence. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but I think the short answer is yes, that I agree with Ezekiel.
Let's see. For sequential test, observed power is still not necessary?
Absolutely. I mean, there are a few approaches where something like observed power is used, but yeah, really not something that I would be looking at, especially from the point of a user. Like if following the test, you start looking at, okay, what power did we achieve or something like that. Observed power is not the way. You just do your standard power analysis and you can check, okay, once you have a power graph, it's going to look exactly like this for sequential tests. It's not going to be different. I mean, obviously it's going to be different if some of the parameters are the same. But anyways, the idea is the shape is going to be the same. It's not going to be some distorted monstrosity or anything like that. And so you can just say, okay, I mean, that's my power function. We had good power to detect these effect sizes and mediocre power to detect these. And then finally here we have almost no chance. But yeah, that's exactly the same graph that you would produce before the test as the one that you would see after the test. There's not going to be any change. Even like I think, okay, I think I understand where the question might be stemming from. Maybe it's from the fact that the sequential test might have ended early with a smaller sample size. So then if you start using that sample size with a fixed sample size power calculator, it's going to tell you something different. I understand that. Well, the whole idea of power is probabilistic. So the fact that the test stopped earlier does not mean in any way that it has compromised on power. In fact, if you're using a futility stopping bound, it's going to be strictly following the power curve. So it won't, if it said you have 80% to detect, 80% probability to detect the true effect of 4.9, then no matter when the test stopped, you maintained that probability throughout the sequential test. And yeah, you don't have to worry about that. Can you please ask if that answered the question? Because I'm not sure if I...
Yeah. That would be, yeah, so we've got two different names here. Is it, do you go by Junior or do you go by, is it Jose? Do we answer the question? I'm gonna go with yes.
Okay, yeah. And if there is a follow-up, I'm happy to clarify.
Yeah. And then last question is from Garrett. Indirectly related topic. We often have the issue of not being able to predict ahead of time the means and standards or standard deviations. It just says STDs. So standards.
Yeah, okay.
We're calculating samples sizes.
We're in the statistics realm still, so.
Yeah. For calculating sample sizes due to complex logic and targeting. As a workaround, we're exploring using the first week of the control group, which will have the right mean and standards for getting at accurate sample size calculation, telling the test owner to change test duration to adapt to the updated required sample size. Do you see any pitfalls with this approach?
Minor ones. I wouldn't say this is the same as applying as using observed power. So whatever pitfalls they are inherent to sample size and power calculations before the test, and they are not specifically related to observed power or DMD confusions that have been mentioned here. So yeah, I would warn about extrapolating from too little data, like from 1 week. Yes, it can give you an idea of the standard deviation and the mean. If you don't have historical data, let's say on that segment or whatever, I can definitely see the case. I would be careful, however, if there is, yeah, exactly. Thank you, Kelly. Seasonality and other considerations of this kind. yeah, I would be careful to include those. So in my head, the ideal scenario of planning the sample size for a test versus its duration is, if you're modeling as a time series the number of users you'll be getting for that segment, and that time series modeling should be based on at least some historical data, at least one going 1 year back. Ideally more, but sometimes you're a startup, you don't have more data. Sometimes it's not retained for whatever reason. But if you have it, I would definitely use that to more rigorously predict what the test duration will be, and yeah, what sample size I'll be able to achieve in 3, 4, 6, 8, whatever number of weeks.
Yeah. Leaving out the fact that we all just went through a lovely pandemic that threw all that data out. So
Yeah, that's true. I mean, obviously that's a good point, that we had like major events like this obviously disturb a lot of user patterns, business patterns, and the like. So
yeah, but thank you so much. I'm hoping that we get to welcome you back to talk about program ROI in the near future, because this was
we'll
lovely.
see.
I learned a lot. I'm pretty sure everybody else did too. I'm sure there's going to be more questions and that you can answer over in the TLC Slack. Thank you so much. Everybody have a great weekend. And the recording
Thanks,
will be up
everyone.
in, I don't know, an hour or so. Thanks all.